So I want to set the stage a little bit for the discussion. As I mentioned, we're talking about pending changes to financial aid and the free application for federal student aid, or FAFSA form. These changes were the result of the FAFSA Simplification Act, which was enacted in December of 2021. Today's discussion is very much a state of the state as of today. As you will pick up throughout the conversation, there continues to be some moving pieces with both the proposed changes, the timeline for implementation, and really the legislative progress, and kind of all three, I guess, together. And so I would imagine that we'll be having another conversation in the future as more of these go into implementation, and perhaps there might be some additional changes. So with all that being said, let's begin with a little bit of history about why financial aid changes, what was kind of the impetus for thinking about these, and kind of how does all that process work. And so I'll kick it over to our panel members, and Mary, maybe I'll start with you.
I'll catch your ball, Jonathan. So the history of financial aid, we could certainly spend a day on, but we won't. And so I think what's interesting is again, we have these two formulas. And when we look at the federal methodology, it's really, this would be my professional opinion, it's really about allocating federal dollars. That's the intent. It's not really about assessing a family's true ability or capacity to pay. And that world changed actually way back in like 1992. Which is around 1997 is when the CSS profile was born, because aid administrators like the three of us really felt we needed to be able to look at how families approached college and how they thought about financing or paying. And so that institutional methodology was created to be much more of an assessment of a family's ability to pay. And so I think this newest changes, and as Jonathan alluded to, originally these were to be implemented in 23, 24. Then most of them were pushed over to 24, 25, and there is some conversation now that it might be as late as 25, 26, because the intent of these changes from a congressional perspective is that when we think about simplification, is that congressional members and Department of Ed are thinking all elements should be able to come from a tax return. And so as we go through some of the changes, and Bonnie and Tom and I talk about those, you're going to see that it's very much adding or elimination of data elements that are or are not on the federal tax return. And right now, it's our understanding that the IRS is having challenges creating this data transfer system, which will be different than the current data transfer system. So the why, I really think, is about simplification. We know from the pre-submitted questions and even being out in the public and talking through high school financial aid nights and whatnot, I know one of the biggest concerns is that change in taking away the number in college. I think we probably could all talk about the different philosophies of why that was. One for why are they taking it away? I'm not exactly sure, but the argument, I guess, is why should a family get a discount if you have two in college versus, my kids were spread apart. I never got a discount or a BOGO, buy one, get one, half price, because I had two in college at the same time. So I think there could be some argument made that particular change is trying to provide more equity in the treatment of all families, regardless of counting them all, counting number in college at the same time. And the old premise of paying for college over time. So I don't know if Bonnie or Tom have more to add to that.
Mary, I think you did a great job of giving some of the context of why we are, where we're at and what it means. But I also just want to continue to make the distinction between, which you pointed out, that determining federal eligibility is much different than institutional, mainly because of, especially for us in the private sector, it's the amount of aid that we're offering to our students that needs to have more scrutiny, if you will, to understand the family's financial circumstances. And for instance, with a Pell Grant being about 6,000 and then supplemental grant may be with that, then the rest is subsidized and unsubsidized loans, and that's also limited. And I know at USC, our average need-based grant is approaching $45,000. So I like to describe it that way, that to be equitable and for the amount of money that we're distributing, which is literally 20 times the amount of federal Pell Grant our students receive, that we want to ensure that we're relying on not just the tax information, since that's really establishes tax liability, not necessarily a statement of the family's financial net worth or financial capability. With two in college, my understanding is that because the data, and you're right, we're going from data retrieval where the student or parent says, I will allow the retrieval of the data, it's a forced push of that data and a connection that may take longer to do than they had thought. And that's an important distinction, is they can't get the number of students in college from the tax return data. So they want to be able to tell a student if they qualify for a Pell Grant and how much of a Pell Grant they'll qualify for. For us, and I think for my colleague institutions, especially that are meeting full need or getting close to it, they're going to be sensitive to the number of students in college. I've been sensitive to families I've known that have had children 4 years apart and are paying much more over 12 years or 8 years versus those who have children close in age. And I've heard of families doing weird things like having a student stay out a year so they double up. So there'll be some things that'll change, but I would think that well-resourced institutions that are providing a significant amount of aid are going to provide aid. And just like in some cases where institutional is going to give more aid than federal methodology, there'll be more instances of that. I think sometimes our families think it's always the other way around.
And I'm just going to add that I think, again, for people who are working with clients or in questions, they have to understand what school they're applying to and what they use in terms of determining eligibility. Because while, again, our colleagues that, on this webinar today, we all use the profile, but there are also some schools that will use the FAFSA for their own institutional aid. So, you can have clients whose families are being treated differently, even within the same family, assuming one family member goes to a school that only uses the FAFSA and maybe for their own institutional aid. And then another family member might be using the FAFSA, we'd be using the FAFSA for federal aid, which we need to, but might be using the profile for institutional aid. So FAFSA simplification isn't always FAFSA simplification, especially within a household that might have multiple children at the same time being assessed under different methods.
And just a very quick addition so that the group is aware, the FAFSA is still going to include a question on number in college. And they're doing that because states have not made a decision yet on what they're going to do. And some states really want to include that. So with that, it won't be just limited to states. Schools will also get that data. But the question to me will be, and what are you going to do as a school to assess what that means? Because there's no underlying methodology that will support that within the system. You'll have data, but nothing to tell you how to use that data. So I think that's a piece to be aware of as well.
That's really important. And I think, that distinction is helpful as well, especially because if families continue to see that question asked, there might be, a little bit of confusion on that. So I want to, and thank you all for kind of that introduction and kind of the thinking and, a little bit of the history. I want to kind of maybe just kind of close the loop on the number in college question, because I think that and each of you shed some light on it. And when we heard from folks attending this webinar, that was definitely one of the questions that folks asked about. And so, as it states right now, if you have multiple children, it's kind of that expected family contribution cut in half, kind of a portion to each student. And so the proposed changes would eliminate that. And so, to each of your points, knowing that that's the proposed changes on the federal side, one question that we did get along these same lines is, and I think I know the answer to this, but on the institutional side, will it be something that, again, Tom, you said those schools that are doing institutional methodology using the profile, will it be something that is going to be determined on a case by case basis? Do you anticipate some policy will be put in place? How do you see that kind of playing out?
Well, I don't see it being a case by case. I think we're going to recognize that families that have more than one child in college, we should make some allowance for that. And to also point out that profile schools, I'm not splitting every family's contribution in half. I'm doing it prorated based on the cost of the institution where the other student is going. So that's an important distinction, that already there's a variance in how number in college is treated at the federal and institutional level.
And that's interesting because we don't. So again, there's, when you are using institutional methodology, you do have a lot of different options. So again, for, people who are trying to, respond to clients, institutional methodology allows us a lot of leeway. And so what Tom or Mary may be doing, I might be doing something very differently, either because of the resources that we have to offer to our families, or just how we feel in terms of principle, how we want it. So there's a whole lot of different ways we could treat it. But again, when we go to the federal situation, we've got to treat them similarly. We got to treat them the same, not even similarly, because we're prescribed, we have a methodology. Now we can make some case by that's where we make case by case adjustments, because we can't take everybody and say, oh, you know what, we don't agree with this, multiple number in college that is being taken away. We can't just do that on a carte blanche basis. That would have to be on a professional judgment basis within the allowances that the federal methodology allows us. So again, there's a whole lot of questions out there and a lot of things in terms of how the institutions are going to use it, depending on what formula they're using and the individual family circumstance, again, for federal methodology.
So I would say at Notre Dame as of today, we are definitely going to continue to use institutional methodology. We'll still be using the number in college adjustment. Like Bonnie and Tom, there are things we don't allow. So an example, and we don't hide it, we don't count a graduate student in college for our money.
That's right.
Because we don't believe that it's our responsibility as an institution to pay for a second degree, especially when the federal definition already says those students are independent. So we certainly intend to continue to use that factor. I think part of where some of the confusion might occur for families is whenever this is implemented, right? So even if I keep the number in college constant for our money, which is the most important, as Tom said, it's by far much more than what the feds contribute to us, is how maybe when the students started, they were eligible for an interest-free subsidized loan. And under these new policies, that same family, they may have two in college, their scholarship stays the same, but they lose that student loan subsidy. So again, there's so many moving parts to what is changing here that I think those could be confusing to a family. And I anticipate our phone ringing and people wondering why we didn't give their students a federal direct subsidized loan any longer. So I think those can be just as confusing as what else is going to be happening with new students entering into the marketplace with the changes.
Absolutely. So, and thank you for that perspective. And I think it's very, very important, Bonnie, as you mentioned, kind of understanding that different schools are going to be treating this in a different way, but knowing that there will be a policy at the school in place, depending on, again, a number of resources and priorities at the college. I want to transition into another change that's proposed to happen. We had a few questions about this as well, and that is the on the FAFSA form, the reduction in questions or the proposed reduction in questions. And so this change is certainly getting a lot of attention. I think it's getting a lot of attention from families and from clients of folks probably on this call, is that the proposed reduction in the total number of questions on the FAFSA form from right now, the maximum of 108 down to, we are hearing around the 36 number. And so, what are you hearing about in terms of the reduction in questions? I guess maybe not which ones will be reduced, but what are the themes of the questions that will stay? And then, which ones will be eliminated, and kind of how you see that impacting families as they're going through the process.
There's as I say, the devil's in the detail. And
Sure.
for this, there's a whole lot of detail. So I don't think we have enough time in an hour webinar for this. But the theme of this is the things that are staying are those questions that can easily be transferred from the IRS to the tax return, or to the FAFSA. I'm sorry. I mean, that's the underlying basis for this. It's simplification, for the family in completing it. They don't want the family to have to sit and think and to pull out all their tax information and have a stack of documents when they're completing the FAFSA. It's supposed to be a lot more seamless, that this family will, the data will all transfer over from the IRS to the FAFSA. And that basically is kind of the thrust of where the simplification comes in. Of course, you're not going to be able to do the asset information because right now that's not on the tax return. But in terms of the income information, it's everything related to what's on the tax return. And they're also removing some untaxed pieces, basically because they can't get them from the tax return. So that's the theme of this whole simplification at this point.
And I think, Bonnie, just to add on as a detail, an example that I know for Notre Dame families that will be a huge benefit for them will be the elimination of a 401k, a 403b, a 457, those retirement plans that we would pick up off a W-2 because it's a tax document, but it's not the tax return. So that won't be asked anymore. Well, in my population, I have people who divert $20,000 to $50,000 per year over into tax deferred contributions. And so eliminating $50,000 of income will significantly decrease that family contribution, and perhaps for those families offset the number in college. But for those poor folks who do an IRA contribution or a self-employment plan, a SEP contribution, those come off a tax return. So inherently there's some inequities. If it's not on the return, it won't be counted, but since those are on the return, they'll be counted. So there wouldn't be a change in their contribution because they were there before, they'll still be there. I think with the number of questions, simple is not always best, is what I always say. And so for my world, I need to have a more holistic picture. And to me, the profile gives that. And perhaps it's helpful for you to know that the College Board is actually piloting right now a shorter CSS profile. So I know we are one of the schools. I can't remember, Bonnie or Tom, if you're part of that pilot program, but there's not many more questions on the shorter profile, but they're much more directed and using much more smart logic in terms of what's going to be asked for a family.
I would also say there are just a few eligibility changes also. So they're no longer asking, for instance, selective service registration, although that's also in effect this year, but the question wasn't changed. So the reductions are mainly on the type of items they've discussed, though.
One of the other things that financial aid office or the financial aid community is concerned about, though, is that because of some of this simplification and not getting some of the data that we needed, for schools that don't use the profile, some schools are talking about possibly developing their own institutional application So while we might be simplifying the federal process in terms of the FAFSA, there may be some schools that say, well, but for our own aid, we're going to use the FAFSA with an extra, but not the profile. So there could be a little more or a little less simplification for some schools that feel that, wow, for our own aid, we can't get away without considering some of the things we did in the past. So it could be a little bit of a wild west. Again, we don't know, we're not sure. This is all conjecture, but that's one of the things that, you hear in different circles.
Yeah, and thank you for addressing that. That was actually one of the questions that came in from one of our panelists, or excuse me, one of our attendees beforehand, and also just in the chat. So yeah, there could be more institutions moving to use either the profile, even if in a shorter pilot phase, or developing their own form. And so that could, just something for advisors to be aware of in communicating with their clients, that list might grow. So another change I want to talk about, and keep the questions coming, appreciate them. We're weaving in some of the questions that we got ahead of time. Another change happening, and I think it's important to address this because this one's getting also a lot of attention, might not be as significant compared to some of the others, but this whole idea of the EFC going away, the expected family contribution, and that being replaced with SAI, or student aid index. Families, parents, clients are very familiar with hearing, advisors are very familiar with hearing about the EFC, which is that number calculated after you submit the FAFSA form. So it's being replaced but with SAI. Why the name change? Is it truly just a name change, or are there other things that accompany SAI versus EFC?
Tom, we're both laughing.
Yeah.
You could go ahead and answer, or I'll answer. I'm old. It's Back to the Future. The EFC,
Well,
SAI years and years ago.
and we've always had a Pell index.
Yes.
So for an aid administrator, index or contribution.
I think in some ways, maybe the move away from expected family contribution will help the family understand that that's not their bill. Because so many families think that EFC equals, this is what I'm going to pay. And I'm sure, as all of you know, really what it's determining is federal and state eligibility in aid. So if my EFC is this, then I get this Pell. And again, it's not really assessing family ability to pay. So to me, I would have called it a PGI, a Pell Grant Index, but they didn't really ask me. So SAI really is a name that it was years and years ago. And it says what it is. How we translate that into what am I going to pay, I think is really what our roles in financial aid, and again, in your roles as advisors, financial advisors. How do you pay your share of the child's educational costs? So to me, it's a name change. Yes, there's a formula change, but I don't see the SAI, the move in the word or the phrasing, as a big thing.
I would agree with that, Mary. And I think that it will be helpful because, I've used the term estimated rather than expected. And again, as we remind ourselves that there's a very limited domain of schools in the US that really meet full need. And of course, that's our calculation of what full need is. So having an aid index, I think, eliminates some of that expectation and allows us to say that your federal aid is based on that index, and we're taking into account the financial circumstances of the family. And we, as aid administrators, we're not, we're used to seeing a negative amount, but it just didn't affect it in the same way that this new negative SAI will allow more students to qualify, whether or not for a full Pell Grant, but at least a partial Pell Grant. So I think that's another thing that we expect there'll be an expanded number of students eligible, just maybe not at the maximum amount. Maybe some of both.
Thank you. Another change that's going on, and something that I think does maybe carry a little more weight for families, and so certainly with advisors in kind of educating their families, is a change in the income protection allowance. And Mary, I think you referenced this earlier, but as part of the FAFSA calculations, there is an income protection allowance built into the formula that essentially protects a portion of the income from being counted towards the EFC or SAI. And so this is changing. It is increasing for both parents and students. And so can you talk a little bit about the income protection allowance, the IPA, kind of how it functions now, and if increasing it, well, do you anticipate that will have an impact on families, or what impact do you think that'll have on families? Bonnie, maybe
Bonnie, you want to go?
Yeah.
Well, obviously the protection allowance is there, so we're not taking, families assume that we're taking 100% of their income, and that's not the case. So allowing the protection allowance to go up will kind of preserve or save a little more income for the family. But there are also some other, what you've been giving also is being taken away. But there's some other things like state, and I think it's local taxes that are being removed. We don't have the full assessment of what's going to happen. So a lot of this is just conjecture in terms of what it might actually do, but it's not being removed, it's increasing, but then some other part of the formula. And so this is really a bowl of mixed nuts. You can pick out the kinds you want, and you'll get your almonds and your macadamia nuts, but still the walnuts are going to be there. And what effect does that have to the whole blend of that, of that snack bowl? We haven't had enough examples, or just things are just starting to bubble up in terms of what that means for the family's student aid index. And in some cases their index is going to increase, and in some cases their student aid index is going to decrease. As Tom mentioned, the anticipation is that there's going to have a lot more families at the lower middle income area range that are going to qualify for more Pell. And they probably still would have qualified for the subsidized or for work study or things like that. But then we're going to have families, because of some of these other things that are taken out, that are no longer going to qualify, that may have. So, and I know we talked already about the number in college, but that's just one piece of this whole pie. And so all of this has to be taken into consideration together. And we're just learning a lot about what may happen. And we just got some case studies recently. We don't think haven't had enough time and enough, information about what's going to happen overall, and that's where we stand at this point. For those who are using we use both federal and institutional methodology, but for students that schools that only use federal, I don't think we have enough data or guidance, I should say, from the department as to kind of what's going to happen overall. So we're still working on this.
I think one of the interesting pieces, and Bonnie, I agree with you, is there is still so much going on. I think one of the things that actually I looked at more because of Phil Levine, and a conversation I recently had with Phil, was his observation. And for those of you who don't know Phil, he's an economist and does a lot of work in the space of affordability and access and the economics of paying for college and aid and whatnot. And he noted that the student income protection allowance, which there really hasn't been much of one, is significantly increasing as well. So his point to me was that even a student who earned nothing in the summer will get a much larger income protection allowance that will actually allow a reduction to the parent side of the equation. I have not, like Bonnie said, I don't think any of us have had the chance to model any of this, but in Phil's perspective, he's concerned about that because it could actually benefit families who probably shouldn't get Pell, but might. And again, some of the data I think Bonnie referred to that I've seen too is that in some cases there are families who are up to $150,000 who could slide into Pell eligibility because of all of these. They might be able to check all of these boxes that we've referred to. And yet, on the other hand, when we just look at number in college implication, we see escalating family contributions. I'd say 70 to 90,000 is, again, we've done some work here at the university looking at what's going to happen with those contributions. So I know the other one we've seen is certainly 93%, I think it is something like that, of families under 40,000 of income. So again, this is income on the federal side. So if they've reduced their income because of tax, legal tax of losses or whatever, business write-offs, $40,000 and below, 93% of the families now will receive Pell. And 76% of students will qualify for the maximum Pell. So I think when we go back to Jonathan's first question about why, I think there is clearly in this whole package of changes a desire to get Pell Grant funds into the hands of more families.
Right. Which is certainly a positive thing, especially for those families. If we're kind of looking at college costs and looking at supplementing what the institutions can give, obviously the more that they can provide and qualify for on the Pell Grant side would be a positive. I want to transition to an audience question because I think it's a real good one and something that we were going to address later. But someone asked grandparent assets and assistance. And so the question apparently no longer to be considered as untaxed income on the FAFSA. Any discussion in the financial aid community about having a separate form to include any assistance? So have you heard of any discussion, essentially the nuances now that when a family completes a FAFSA form, they need to report money paid on your behalf, money or bills paid on your behalf. It's a prior year payment. That question is proposed to go away in the upcoming FAFSA. So advantageous to grandparents, but have you heard of any discussion about adding to an asking for that, or would that even be allowed, I guess is my question. And will that stay on the profile? I guess is maybe I'll throw it out there. All those questions.
Well, right now the profile is staying the same. There's, we always look at it, it's always being looked at in terms of trends or things that change. But right now the position is, we think it's an economically sound method to determine a contribution. So that's not coming up. They're not expecting any changes there, except as Mary referenced, this profile light, kind of asking a little less questions, but still using the same overall concept. But I think I talked a little earlier that I think some schools might say, you know what, for our own aid, we want to, we can't live without some of the things. I should say our budgets, the school's budget might be strained. And if they start eliminating or not considering things that they've considered in the past, it might be too much of a strain on their institutional budget. And so could there be a proliferation of additional forms? That's one of the fears that is discussed. And I think that's one of the kind of the impetus between the profile light to hopefully maybe have some families or schools that haven't used the profile before because they felt it was too lengthy. But maybe if they can get the same, a more robust assessment than FM with some lighter questions or some less questions, it might eliminate schools having to do their own form. But, each school is going to treat that as it is, because whether it's profile or profile light, the student would still have to pay for it unless they meet certain income thresholds, because there are some students that can get the profile free. But, right now we're still not sure. The jury isn't out as to what's going to happen. And I think not until we either, have a lot of things to model or we go through a year and say, wow, we blew our budget, or we didn't blow our budget. We don't know what's, it's a possibility, but we don't know.
And Bonnie, the profile asks also, it collects information on other contributions that are coming in, and it asks for information about other children that are attending college and what kind of support they get. That information will still probably be taken into consideration, but that goes back to where you said it's the school's policy and budget and how they're trying to use that information. So I know, for instance, some colleges will provide less aid because a sibling is getting full scholarship support, and others just ignore that information. Others ignore grandparent type commitment to funding. And then there's, of course, the whole issue of non-custodial contribution, et cetera.
Excellent. So I want to and keep the questions coming in. Thank you, everyone. I want to kind of move into some, we kind of hit some of the big changes here. SAI replacing EFC, kind of talked about the income protection allowance, discussed the reduction in questions. Thank you to our panelists for hitting on, kind of keeping us mindful of FAFSA versus CSS profile and institutions, kind of having that discretion there and kind of continuing to use that CSS profile. A few more questions, additional changes that came up and that we are anticipating happening. One of them is the use of professional judgment. And so if professional judge, I guess so, professional judgment in general and kind of how institutions are using professional judgment. And so if you could touch on, I guess, what is professional judgment, first of all, and then as part of the legislative changes, what are the changes that might be implemented, and are they significant changes, or are they something that many institutions are already doing?
What I would say about professional judgment, the good part is the legislative rules say very little about exercising professional judgment, which is, knock on wood, that we are not told how to exercise professional judgment, other than we cannot, I think Bonnie mentioned earlier, we can't just say about a class of students, we don't like this policy and therefore we will eliminate X. So we can't do that. Professional judgment has to be exercised on a case-by-case basis. It has to be documented. And in my experience, schools vary in terms of how much professional judgment. So the law will now say you can no longer categorically say we're not going to make any professional judgments. If you don't have any, if I was in your shop, I would say you best justify the why you said no every time. But the reality is there's a workload issue, and then there's a money issue, right? So professional exercise of professional judgment, families, I think, sometimes think that it's going to end up in more gift money, and that's just not true. Even at Notre Dame, right? It may not end up in more gift. You may get the option for a loan, a subsidized loan. You might get some additional gift, but resources are another driver. So if I'm at a school that has a very limited budget, the family might have a very reasonable, we had these huge medical expenses. I can look at that, but if I don't have any more gift money from the university, I'm really only looking for that judgment maybe for additional Pell or a subsidized loan. So my read of the PJ section doesn't change my practice at all. We are very clear, for example, on our website, what we consider and what we don't. So paying for, and I'm not kidding, paying for your child's wedding, even though it was expensive, is not something I'm going to consider. On the other hand, medical expenses, we're a private school, so private school tuition, plus loan borrowing for prior children, not loans that you're paying off for your child. So we outline for our families the things we will consider. and we require specific documentation, and I anticipate will continue. So again, while it is coming up more, I'm wondering if it's not necessarily a big thing for our schools, but perhaps schools who are less resourced, or I would think of, say, Northeastern or USC, right, where there's tens of thousands of students. And how do you deploy a staff to look at thousands of PJ requests, some of which are reasonable and some of which are somewhat frivolous? So that's my 2 cents on that, PJ.
I think you hit it right, Marion. There is a staffing situation, but I do think for many schools who have said no policy, we don't do it, hasn't helped students that might have been helped with a Pell Grant, but they have to have the staffing available to make those and document it to the satisfaction of the department. And all of us have gone through the pandemic and having to apply professional judgment for anywhere more 30 to 50 or 70% more cases than a normal year. And the other thing, though, that's also helpful in this legislation is the codification of a period of national emergency and the flexibility with unemployment income not being counted, and that was codified and not subject to guidance that was questionable. And again, those are the type of things where the department can help us as aid administrators by being more clear with guidance.
But not rules, right? I think that's where we hope they continue to stay up. Bonnie, I apologize.
Well, that's right.
What I was going to say, I think the bottom line for anybody who is working with families is that if they think they have a circumstance, to bring it up to the school, and the school will be the judge. And you've got 3 schools here, and we probably would treat that family very differently for our own institutional aid. In fact, I know that we do. That's what makes all of us unique. And for federal methodology, there's again certain things we can do, certain things we cannot do, but we're going to have to, say, okay, I can do this, I can't do that. We have a whole lot more flexibility for our own institutional aid. Federal, I think we probably have a little more adherence to certain principles, but if their child is looking at 3 or 4 or 5 different schools, they could get 3 or 4 or 5 different answers, as Mary pointed out, depending on the school and its resources, because there's just only so much. We don't get any more budget because we have more needy students. Some schools do. Some schools, if they're meeting 100% of need, they may have an unlimited budget. Right now, we're not meeting 100% of need. And so just as a family has to work within a budget, we need to work within a budget and can only go so far out in terms of saying, okay, we could do something. Absolutely, we do professional judgment, but we may not be as generous with the additional aid, or maybe we are in some others. Again, also could depend on the area that you're in, where you live. There could be very significant changes that have happened in the area where most of your population is from. And so you need to take that into consideration. And so, a family could get 3 or 4 different responses, but I think it's important for them to contact the school and say, here's our situation. It's not what it was 2 years ago. This is where we sit today. And then, work with the school or schools that the child is most interested in.
That's excellent. And such an important point, right, about communication, right? Understanding that every institution is going to be doing it a little bit differently, and then understanding that kind of communicating with that financial aid office earlier rather than later is a very important, and understanding kind of what the policies might be. I want to take, maybe one more audience question before we kind of move into kind of a wrap up here. We had someone submit a question about on the change for single parents being driven away from the custody question to a financial support question. Do you feel that the person claiming the exemption will be the FAFSA filer? Obviously, that offers more opportunities for single parents to divert the exemption to the lower earning spouse. And so I think what this is in reference to is right now in a divorced or separated situation on the FAFSA side, the student is indicating the custodial parent as the parent that they lived with the most over the past 12 months. this is changing to the parent who provides the greater portion of the student's financial support. A lot of times those are the same, but I guess it's being put into place that the student should be reporting the family or the parent that provides more financial support. And so is this just kind of this is something that is intended to happen and put into place? And is this just more to ensure that, I guess, that financial support question is accurately being captured? Is that maybe the reasoning for this?
Anybody want to take that, or I'm happy to talk about it. So I think we've always had families, I'll say that at Notre Dame, we often will see the custodial parent changing. So we already at Notre Dame collect what's called the non-custodial profile or a non-custodial parent statement. So it's interesting to see how that changes even now. So I do think there could be, I think this is a confusing definition. I continue to read it because so just reading off of one, if there is an informal separation, they will be considered to still be married and they must follow IRS rules. So now we're going to tax dependency. And we've never really used tax dependency for divorce separated or for any other part of, except way back in the 80s, the tax dependency rules for who completes the form. So in that case of an informal separation, it's the parent who provided more financial support to the student during the prior year, not the person who the students lived with. And again, that's what we've looked at. Who did the student live with more? Who provided more than half the support? That's who it was. And it's going to be a tax year piece. So if they, as you said, Jonathan, it will be during the tax year. So I'm still not quite clear how we use prior year and look at tax dependency unless we're looking at prior year tax returns. So I think this is an area that, especially when we have legal agreements, as all of us know, that change, I get to claim you this year, and Tom, you get to claim our kid next year. I don't think we're going to get the right person completing the information, and certainly could we see gamesmanship of the parent earning less money being the person to complete? Yes, but we see that now. Now it's going to be more specific in the FAFSA world. Did I get that right, guys?
About as right as I think we all know right now, because we are all confused.
Well, and again, this is something where we're all looking at legislation, and we don't yet know the guidance that's going to come out from the department, and it may be more clear or provide more direction for us. But it's already confusing for us because we assess in our statement, it says we're going to take the parent, the step parent, and or the non-custodial parent as appropriate. So I'm as clear as anyone too. It's about collecting the right information to make the right decision. Mm-hmm. Dependency status alone does not make that the right decision. It's really that we expect the family to be the first source of contributing to college, and then we provide our resources on top of that.
I think that's really important to hear from all of you, right? And kind of a theme of what we kicked off today and the webinar with kind of a state of the state right now. And this is continually learning for all of us, both families, certainly advisors working with families. And really, it's still a continuing learning process for all of you who are the professionals who have the most intimate and close connections with this, not the closest, but very close connection with kind of this legislation and what is going on. So I think that, we will certainly be coming back as things, and maybe doing a round 2, potentially round 3. I'm not recruiting you right now, but it would be great if we could get the group back together just as we continue to learn more. And I encourage folks to hopefully, stay connected with us and continue to learn. But I think that, we covered a lot today talking about the state of these changes, some of the things that we know are happening, the reduction in question, SAI replacing EFC, that income protection allowance, keeping an eye on the number of college, that reduction or that split going away on FM, and then some additional changes with with professional judgment and use of non-custodial parents. So before I let our panel members go, I want to, first of all, thank them for their time, their expertise in kind of sharing what they know and their history about what's happening. And so before we do go, I want to ask each panel member just to share a little bit about their institution, not that they're unknown institutions. I'm sure you know each of these very well, but just to share, a little bit about their institution, and then maybe any final words of advice that they might have for advisors as they kind of continue to keep an ear out on these changes. So I'll kick it off to anyone to start first.
Bonnie, alphabetically, you're first there.
Okay. And I probably have alphabetically, the school is probably the last, as
That's right.
Villanova. But that's okay. For those of you who don't know, Villanova, we are a Catholic Augustinian institution. We are about 12 miles north of Philadelphia, connected by 3 train stations right on campus. So if you're interested in the northeastern area, we're very centrally located to New York, Washington, Baltimore, or anywhere up and down the East Coast by train. Very close to the airport. We have we're primarily undergrad, a total enrollment of about 10,000, but 6,700 is the undergrad. We have liberal arts college, engineering, school of business, school of nursing, and we also have a law school, and then a lot of graduate programs contained within either the engineering, liberal arts, or school of business. About 65% of our students receive financial assistance, and that's a lot of that is institutional grant. Our average Villanova grant is about $36,000. We are not meeting 100% of need at this point in time, but that's on our strategic plan. Hopefully by 2030, or if not before, that's one of our main goals at this point in time. And we are ranked by U.S. News and World Report as one of the top 50 institutions in the nation. So I'll defer to the next friend.
All right, I'll go next. It's alphabetical, I guess. USC, of course, is located in Los Angeles, California, near Exposition Park, south of downtown LA. And we enroll about 20,500 undergraduates this fall and almost 28,000 graduate students. Main College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences, 10 professional schools, and 6 schools of visual and performing arts. We're proud of our first-year retention rate, 92%, 6-year graduation rate, 92%. We do meet full need, and we are need blind in admission, and I think that's an important point. And we are 21% of our students receive a federal Pell Grant. We also have Cal Grant in our state, and 14% receive the Cal Grant, and more than about 2/3 receive some form of financial aid. So thank you.
Thank you. I guess I'm last here. So University of Notre Dame, we're located in Notre Dame, Indiana. And we have about 8,000 undergraduate students, and we also have graduate students, professional students. Our newest school opened opened a few years ago, but our newest undergraduate major comes in the form of the Kehoe School of Global Affairs. So it's a really exciting time at the university as we see internationalization really taking over. Like USC, we are need blind and we meet full need. Our average university-based scholarship this past year was about $55,000, which is almost full tuition. And so we spend about $184 million each year in university-funded grants. So we continue to move and look at ways to make the university affordable. And my words of wisdom would be, save in the college well. This is we're all private schools here because it's the independent 529 College Well savings plan, right? So we all represent private schools for that reason here. And as Jonathan mentioned at the top of the presentation, it's that prepaid piece. And Notre Dame was one of the founding schools. So I say this more from a wisdom piece as one of the best things that families can do is save, and prepaid tuition plans. The some of the savings that families are experiencing by paying dollars today to buy future tuition dollars, the savings that a family can take advantage of are pretty significant. So we don't know where any of this is going, but I think one of the things I know for sure is if we wait long enough, the feds will change the rules again, maybe even before we have these figured out. And that I know I like to earn interest instead of paying interest. So I appreciate all the work that you do to work with families in terms of thinking about financing college, whether it's a grandparent or you're working with parents or that aunt or whomever. I find that to be a significant strength of families when they have some savings. It doesn't have to be the whole thing, but to me, savings is choice. And I don't have to bet on what this formula is going to do if I've done some savings. So, and I try to help families think about what I can buy with what I've been able to save versus, but I can't save the whole thing. So there's my word of wisdom along with who our schools are.
Well, thank you all so much, Mary, Bonnie, Tom. We appreciate the time once again, sharing your wisdom, helping us think through, helping advisors think through what they should be aware of as these changes continue to evolve. Thank you again for attending. Have a good rest of your afternoon and week, and we'll see you at the next one. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.